In this video, we're going to talk about the SEC's proposed vendor due diligence or service provider due diligence rule. Again, my name is Michael Rasmussen. I'm the founder of United Atlantic Legal Services. I'm an international attorney focused on investment advisor firms in the United States and the United Kingdom. This is my YouTube series called Last Week, This Week in RIA Compliance. You can also check out our blog. We have some good information there. So again, we're going to cover what the SEC is talking about with its new proposed vendor or service provider due diligence rule. The proposed rule just came out last November, maybe it was, and it outlines a whole new scheme in which our investment advisor clients are going to need to work in with their service providers. So it's a very important rule. It's not a final rule, obviously, and the SEC is still taking comment on the proposed rule, so there may be some significant changes. But I did want to give you some idea of where the SEC, your regulator, is kind of looking and the direction we're most likely heading when it comes to service provider due diligence. So we begin with the idea of who is a service provider covered by the rule and what types of functions are these service providers offering to investment advisors that would fall within the rule. So service provider, pretty self-explanatory term, just generally means somebody outside of the investment advisor firm that's offering a service to that investment advisor firm. The covered functions, though, piece of it is a little bit more tricky. And I'm going to go ahead and just read the definition that the SEC has put together. So under the proposed rule, a covered function would be a function or service that is necessary for the investment advisor to provide under its investment advisory services, and two, that if not performed or performed negligently, would reasonably likely to cause a material negative impact on the advisor's clients or the advisor's ability to provide investment advisory services. So really what we're looking at is two elements here. The first of which is it has to be related to the core kind of services that the investment advisor offers, and then it has to be material to those services. Some ideas or some service providers that the SEC noted that would likely fall underneath this rule are sub-advisors, cybersecurity providers, portfolio managers, if you're outsourcing those, trading desk services, any company that would provide valuation services for you, and of course, your friendly compliance professionals like myself. The SEC considers these people to be service providers offering a covered function. So you're going to go through your list of all of your service providers. Do they meet these two definitions and do they fall within the rule? If so, the next step is to make a determination whether or not it's appropriate to outsource those service providers or outsource those functions to those service providers. There's a number of factors that the SEC laid out in the proposed rule. The first of which is the nature and the scope of the covered function. Is this something you could do more efficiently in-house and with less risk to clients if that was formed in-house? Is there a way for you to mitigate and manage the risk of having it being provided by a third-party service provider? Have you done your due diligence on this service provider? And does that service provider have the competence, capacity, and resources to provide that service? So for example, if it's a new startup cybersecurity firm that you're looking to work with, do they actually have the resources to respond to a serious or significant cyber event that your investment advisor firm might face? Additionally, the SEC wants you to look at any subcontracting agreements. So oftentimes, service providers will subcontract out their responsibilities to third parties. And the SEC wants to make sure that you understand when and where this is happening and whether or not further due diligence should be done on those subcontracted third parties. The last element that the SEC laid out is whether or not you could go through an orderly termination process. So what this means is that if things don't work out with that particular service provider, or if you're going to switch service provider, is there an efficient and clean way of making that transition from one provider to the next? So those are your concepts and ideas. You have a service provider, they're offering a covered function, and then you go through that list of criteria that I just talked about to make a determination of whether or not it's appropriate to outsource that particular service. Once you've made the determination that it is appropriate to outsource that service, then you have to take a look at your ongoing monitoring requirements. This is going to fall most likely on your compliance department, of course, but in addition, it's going to fall on that particular department that that service provider is supporting. So if there's a service provider supporting your client care team, for example, then that client care team should be intimately involved in the ongoing monitoring of that service provider as well. So it needs to be an initial due diligence and then that ongoing due diligence as well. So some other considerations that are in the proposed rule that our compliance professionals will want to know about is that there's actually a section that talks about the updates to the ADV Part 1A. As many of you know, the ADV Part 1A is one of the forms we submit to regulators. It's a publicly available document, but it tells the regulators certain critical information about the investment advisor firm. And they want to add a section where the investment advisors are listing out those service providers that they've decided to engage with for those covered functions. So, regardless of whether or not the SEC adopts this rule or not, I think it's an important time for all of the investment advisors out there to take a moment and take a look at how they're managing service providers. Do you have a list of all of your service providers? Have you gone through and done any sort of risk analysis on those service providers? And then have you conducted your initial and ongoing due diligence of those service providers? So that was a really broad general overview of the proposed rules. Again, it's that proposed rule, so things could change significantly before the final rule is produced. However, I think it's important for our investment advisors out there to really get their hands around service provider due diligence, because obviously it's an area that they're going to be looking at. So thank you for watching. If you like videos like this, please hit the subscribe button below. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those as well, and we'll see you in the next video.